So if you're dealing with IBS, and specifically IBS-D or the diarrhea version of IBS, it can really be a life-altering situation. It can make it difficult for people to hold a job and to just have any type of social life at all. I've talked with clients that were dealing with chronic diarrhea type issues that would tell me like, oh yeah, I really wanted to shop at that store, but I need to map out the bathrooms first. I pretty much can't leave the house unless I know exactly where each bathroom is along the way at specific intervals so that I can stop. Otherwise, that's really not going to be my favorite day. So this can be a significant problem for people. And if you're researching this issue, it can be really easy to get a little frustrated with the answers that you're finding or not finding. So in this video, I'm going to give you some steps that seem to create some really quick improvements for some folks. And I'm also going to give you some steps to figure out what issues may be creating this for you and steps you can take over the long term to really turn the situation around. Let's jump in.
TC Hale is not a doctor and does not claim to be a doctor or licensed in any type of medical field. Don't be an idiot and use anything heard on the show as medical advice. This information should be used for educational purposes only, and you should contact your doctor for any medical advice. Now get off me.
So remember, I'm not a doctor and I'm not giving anybody medical advice about their IBS issues, but I'm going to share some studies in the description below this video that will allow you to dig into these topics a little bit further. And by looking at these studies and kind of understanding what are the possible underlying causes, if you can figure out the most common underlying cause that might be creating this for you, it will just help you ask the right questions when you're talking to your doctor about this. So when we're talking about IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, that can be a little bit different than IBD or inflammatory bowel disease. And the difference between these two can have to do with the location of where the trouble may be going on. And when we're looking at inflammatory bowel disease, there's usually some type of structural damage in that digestive tract or the lining of that digestive tract, or something that has created significant inflammation that will get you a label like that. Now, I've also made another video on IBS-C or the constipation version of IBS. And these videos are very similar because some of the underlying causes can be very similar and some of the steps that really benefit folks can be very similar. So I want to go over each of those in both of these videos. But there's different types of IBS when we're going to break down IBS. Even though the whole IBS thing is very common, we really want to look at what type of IBS a person is having. So IBS-C can be the constipation version, where the person with IBS is usually having specific discomforts like bloating or gas or flatulence or cramping or just discomfort in that digestive tract. And then there's something going wrong with the bowels, where either they'll be leading towards this diarrhea with the IBS-D, or they'll be more constipated with IBS-C, and here's the IBS-D, or someone will have IBS-M, or like a mixed situation, where maybe they'll have some days where there's diarrhea and some days where there's constipation, or they'll even go back and forth on the same day, where part of the day they'll feel more constipated and then they'll have some diarrhea. And then there's IBS-U, which is kind of like an unclassified version, like maybe the doctor's like, I don't even know where to start with you. You're just a whole big mess here. So it'll become a little unclassified because it doesn't seem to go back and forth alternating. It's just like, part of the time I'm over here, part of the time I'm really loose and things are going crazy that way. So these can vary greatly, but for most of these diagnoses, they're going to have some type of discomfort and then some type of bowel dysregulation. And with any of these issues, it's interesting, and we want to kind of understand why with some people, some foods will really create trouble and others won't. And then other people with IBS, it'll be a lot different. The types of foods that can bother them can be different. So we want to understand why there's different types of trouble and different foods will affect those differently. So let's look at this study here where we're talking about the efficacy of the low Fodmap diet for treating irritable bowel syndrome, the evidence to date. And they say, in summary, the evidence indicates that restriction of FODMAPs is an effective dietary intervention for reducing IBS symptoms. There are now well-designed clinical trials to support the efficacy of low FODMAP diet with alleviation of GI symptoms in the majority of patients with IBS. And they went on to say up to 86% of patients with IBS found improvements in overall gastrointestinal symptoms as well as individual symptoms such as abdominal pain, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, abdominal distension, and flatulence following the diet. They say that Fodmap restriction reduces the osmotic load and gas production in the distal small bowel and the paroxysmal colon, providing symptomatic relief in patients with IBS. And this study, where they use like a digital personal kind of assistant kind of thing to help people understand which foods might be better for them. In this study, they say that a majority, greater than 70% of participants, showed statistical significant, clinically significant, and persistent improvement in symptoms. Most participants achieved total resolution of symptoms. So that's a pretty big deal when we're just talking about a dietary change. And don't get me wrong, if you've tried some type of elimination diet, or maybe you've tried this low FODMAP diet that I'll explain here in a minute, and you didn't see results, I'm going to help you understand why that can come about. But when we're looking at a low FODMAP diet, what's a FODMAP? And that basically stands for fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyols. So when we're talking about a FODMAP diet, we're usually talking about trying to restrict the level of FODMAPs that we're consuming. So these are basically just usually like carbohydrates or sugars or fibers or artificial type sugar things in foods, and some foods contain higher levels of these and other foods contain lower levels. So what we're finding is that when someone can restrict these FODMAPs and greatly reduce them, that the symptoms that they experience can really improve big time. Now, I don't feel like this is the solution to IBS, but this is a way that a person can really feel a whole lot better. And sometimes feeling a whole lot better is a really big deal, especially if this issue is restricting a person's ability to just be a human. So if you can just change the foods that you're eating and feel and function a whole lot better, that can be life-changing. So I don't want to dig too deep into the diet aspects, but I'll put a link in the description below this video to a page, I think it was on ibsdiet.org or something, that just lists high FODMAP foods and low FODMAP foods. So you can just look at these lists and be like, oh yeah, I eat that all the time. Oh yeah, when I eat that, I really have a lot of trouble and I'm getting bloated. And so you can just try to remove the foods that are on the higher FODMAP list, try to focus more on these lower FODMAP lists, and see, do you improve? See, okay, maybe I can't do it all the time, but if I do it most of the time, I really do see some significant improvement. And a lot of people are really seeing a lot of results with this. Now, my point of view is just doing that. I don't feel like that's really enough. I like us to understand why. Why does this help? And if we understand why, it can give us more clues into what may be creating this for us. And the real problem with IBS is not only do we see all of these varieties of different types, and when you see different types, you have to understand, well, there's different underlying causes because it's showing up differently. It's not just like, oh, I got labeled with this, sorry about my luck. My mom had IBS, so I get to have it too, that's just how it goes. It's not like that. There's physiological issues or malfunctions that are creating these things, and when you can understand what's creating it for you, you can really take steps to create some improvement. So to understand why these foods might become problematic, we need to understand that when we're looking at this digestive process, it's really common for malfunctions to come up. If you've seen any of my videos ever, you've probably seen me talking about some type of digestive malfunction that I blabbed on and on about for hours, because it's really common and it can create a whole lot of trouble. So when we're looking at these FODMAP foods, the problem is a lot of them are fermentable. They're more fermentable than maybe some other types of foods are, which means that there are these bugs, there's these microorganisms in our digestive tract, and they're supposed to be here in the large intestine and kind of help us break down our food. A lot of them make our B vitamins for us and things like that, so they can be very beneficial in our digestive process. But malfunctions can come up that can really magnify any type of fermenting type issue that can end up creating a lot more gases and pressure and all this, I just don't feel so great. So let's look at this study here that talks about study the overlap between IBS and GERD. And they say that there's a strong overlap between GERD and IBS that exceeds the individual presence of each condition. In the absence of GERD, IBS is relatively uncommon, and that's what they saw in this study. And in this study here, they say the effects of long-term PPI treatment on producing bowel symptoms in SIBO, their conclusion was prolonged PPI treatment may provide bowel symptoms and SIBO, therefore the strategy of step-down or on-demand PPI therapy should be encouraged. So we're seeing an association between GERD and IBS, or gastroesophageal reflux disease, some type of acid reflux. But let's take this a little bit further, and we look here at this study on small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and irritable bowel syndrome. And there's conclusions where small intestinal bacterial overgrowth was present in a sizable percentage of patients with IBS with predominance of bloating and flatulence. Older age and female sex were predictors of SIBO in patients with IBS. Identification of possible predictors of SIBO in patients with IBS could aid in the development of successful treatment plans. So when we're seeing an association between IBS and GERD, and then PPI use and SIBO, and then associations between SIBO and IBS, we want to understand why would those come about. So when we're looking at GERD, the first thing to understand is that reflux is not caused by too much stomach acid like advertisers want us to believe. There's this valve at the bottom of the esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter that's meant to open up so when food comes in, it can come on in. And then when we start to acidify that food so that we can break the food down and get the nutrients out of that food, once it starts to acidify, that valve closes so the acid doesn't come back up and burn us. But the problem is this valve is triggered by stomach acid. So if someone only has a small amount of stomach acid, but not enough to trigger this valve, then the small amount of acid they have is going to come back up and burn them. So in most cases of acid reflux, we're seeing a lack of stomach acid, not too much stomach acid. And that can be a really big deal in this conversation because that stomach acid is not just there to help us digest our food so that we can get nutrients out of that food. The stomach acid is the barrier to the whole digestive tract. So when varmints come in on the food that we're eating, they're supposed to die in an acid bath. But when there's not enough acid there, they don't get fried, and then they come in and like, oh, this is really nice, let's set up camp here. And then they raise their kids and they move down here into the small intestine where they really should not be. We should not have a lot of bacteria here. Most of our beneficial bacteria should be in the large intestine. And once they're set up here, then they can also move down into the large intestine and create what's called a dysbiosis issue, or an imbalance of bacteria where there's a lot more bad guys than there are good guys, and they're just creating all kinds of havoc. So when we have malfunctions like a lack of stomach acid is a malfunction. And that's why this study is showing us when somebody uses PPIs long term, and PPIs are a proton pump inhibitor that is used as like an acid reflux medication that removes the body's ability to make that stomach acid. So then there's no acid to come back up and burn the person, and they remove that symptom. They didn't actually fix the underlying cause because the problem was this valve wasn't closing correctly. They didn't fix that. They just removed the acid, so now that symptom is gone. But again, remember, that acid is there for a reason. Mother Nature may not be such an idiot. It's there to keep the bad guys out. So this study is showing that when you use PPIs long term and turn off that acid for a long period of time, it sets up this situation for bad guys to come in and create this SIBO issue, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that's because you have all these bad guys came in because the front door was open. So now here's another association that we're talking about, is that these other studies are showing that when there's SIBO, it's very common to also see IBS. So here's where we can kind of understand. When these invaders are here, they're going to create more gases. These invaders put out waste. In a lot of cases, that waste can be alkaline. So maybe there's invaders up here in the stomach, like an H. pylori infection that's alkalizing the stomach even more. So maybe a person's making a small amount of acid, but now it's getting alkalized by the waste from the bacteria in the stomach. Or maybe the bacteria is here putting out this waste, and a lot of times that waste can be alkaline and slow things down in this digestive tract, and maybe that leads to more of a constipation issue, because our food bolus will move through this intestinal tract at a pace according to its acidity level. So if this stuff moving through is very alkaline, it will move slower, which means it's going to get harder and drier and more difficult to move, and that can be one possible cause of a constipation issue. But if it's more on the acidic side, well, these linings down here in this intestinal tract were not made to hold acids like the stomach is. That can deal with acids up there, but down here, it's very irritating. You can basically digest a hole through your intestinal tract. So the body's like, well, we're not going to do that. Let's bring all the water that we can to cool this down, and then we'll rush it through the system, and it'll lift you off the toilet like a rocket when it comes shooting out the back door. So this is one possible cause of a chronic diarrhea issue, is just malfunctions that are creating pH imbalances to that bolus. So the pH of that can be important. And remember, these invaders that we're talking about have the ability to change pHs due to the waste that they're putting out or the gases they create. A lot of these microorganisms create more gases on their own, so now we're raising the level of gases here, and more gases means that it's going to expand that intestinal tract, which is going to create more bloating and pressure can create more reflux, pushing things back up or pushing the intestinal lining out to create cramping and discomfort or distended bloating. All these things can come from those gases. Now, we're going to take those higher Fodmap foods. Remember, there's aspects to those higher Fodmap foods that make them more fermentable than other foods. So now you have a food that's going to be fermented more, and you have an increase of all these bacteria that are going to do more of that fermenting, and then you can get a major increase in the level of gas that's creating all of this discomfort. So if a person removes those high Fodmap foods, they can at least reduce that level of gas a little bit. And that a lot of times can create a lot of relief for some folks. So some people aren't going to see a lot of improvement there because they have so much gas that's being created by such a significant overgrowth. But if this overgrowth is not as significant, then changing those food choices can make a world of difference. And when we think about the diarrhea aspect, if somebody's dealing with diarrhea with IBS, when somebody gets food poisoning, like a significant food poisoning thing, and they're throwing up, or they have this crazy diarrhea going out the back door, it makes sense to us. Like, oh yeah, you got that invader in there. The body's just trying to get things out any way that it can. Why wouldn't it rush it out the back door like that? Oh yeah, I went down to Mexico, I drank the water, and now I got butt soup. Well, that made sense to us because we knew that there were invaders in that water that was coming in and creating this trouble. But wouldn't it make sense that if someone had maybe a lower level infection that wasn't quite as significant as having some type of food poisoning situation, but there was still invaders in there that the body would try to rush out the system, wouldn't it make sense that maybe they would have diarrhea most of the time, just with the body trying to reduce the burden that it's dealing with? And what's really interesting about IBS is that these symptoms really vary from person to person, just dependent on how their body reacts to that situation. Different people's bodies will deal with burdens in different ways. So some people will end up with a constipation issue just because there's not enough stomach acid to acidify the food correctly. So the pH of that bolus is very alkaline and moving slowly. And some people will have a diarrhea response just because of the level of the overgrowth that the body's like, I really don't want these guys in here. Let's get them out of here any way that we can. And they'll have that constant flow of everything just trying to rush out the back door. So it's really going to vary from person to person, even though the underlying cause could be very similar. And this study here said hydrogen was the predominant gas detected in patients with IBS-D, and methane was the gas detected in IBS-C. So with tests, they can see what type of microorganisms might be predominant in the system and creating either constipation or diarrhea. So that could be a factor as well. But let's look at some other malfunctions that can really create this diarrhea issue. And with the links to these studies that I'll put in the description below, pulling from studies like the high prevalence of cholestasis, which is poor bile flow, it's when bile is not flowing correctly, but studies like the high prevalence of cholestasis with increased conjugated bile acids in inflammatory bowel disease patients, and this study on gallstones, cholestectomy, and irritable bowel syndrome. The Google AI overview of this type of information says studies have shown a significant link between cholestasis, or impaired bile flow from the liver, and irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, particularly with the diarrhea predominant subtype. As abnormal bile acid levels in the gut due to cholestasis can contribute to IBS symptoms like diarrhea, abdominal pain, and bloating, research suggests that alterations in gut microbiota and bile acid metabolisms play a key role in this connection. And in this study here on cholestectomy and associated with a higher risk of irritable bowel syndrome in the UK, they say that cholestectomy was associated with a higher risk of IBS, especially IBS with diarrhea. And we should really dig into this more. So when we're looking at these studies and we're looking at cholestectomy and cholestasis, what that means, cholestasis just means that this bile that's in the gallbladder is not flowing down and helping us digest our food the way that it should. So the liver makes this bile, and then it comes down here and it stores it in the gallbladder for when it's ready to be used. And that gallbladder's job is to store it and then concentrate that bile so that a small amount of bile can be more effective. So once food is acidified in the stomach and leaves the stomach and comes down here into the duodenum, that triggers this gallbladder to squirt this alkaline bile down, and the bile is meant to help us emulsify or break down our dietary fats so we can access fat-soluble vitamins like A, E, D, and K. And it's also meant to help us neutralize the acids that are leaving the stomach because it's more alkaline than these acids. And then all these activities also trigger the pancreas to squirt out things like enzymes and bicarb that is also alkaline and helps us neutralize these acids. So all of these functions are very important for our ability to break our food down so that we can break it down into the elemental nutrients that the body needs to function correctly. So when this gallbladder becomes too thick and sticky to flow correctly, which is very common, then it doesn't come down here and help us digest our food correctly. It doesn't trigger all these processes that help neutralize the acids that are leaving the stomach. So when that's the case, now these acids continue to move through here where they don't belong. And remember, we talked about how the body's going to say, well, we can't have that. We have to cool down these acids and rush it out the back door before it creates all this inflammation in the digestive tract. So when we're looking at those things like the IBD issues or the inflammatory bowel disease, my opinion is that the IBS-D version seems to be more common of the types of problems that could eventually lead to those inflammatory bowel disease, where all of this acid is moving through here. If you took battery acid and just poured it on your arm, you'd be like, oh wow, that creates a lot of inflammation. Now, what if you did that every day? You already have a wound there, you just keep pouring this acid on your arm, oh wow, that's really not going well at all. Why wouldn't that create a lot of inflammation? So if you have acid leaving the stomach and not being neutralized, it has the ability to create a chronic diarrhea issue or worse. And that one study was saying it's really common to see gallstones with this IBS issue. And remember that this job of the gallbladder is to concentrate that bile. So if the bile becomes too thick to flow, and that can happen for a wide variety of reasons. There's a lot of issues that can cause our bile to become too thick and sticky, especially the way that we eat today with all this processed junk. But when it becomes too thick to really flow, then when it's staying in there, it continues to concentrate until it concentrates into sludge and makes the situation much worse, or eventually it can concentrate into stones. So that could be why they're seeing such an association between cholestasis, or poor bile flow, or gallstones, where bile flow was so poor that it concentrated into something different, and this IBS issue. That could be why we're seeing such a strong associations there. Now, for a lot of folks, they'll eventually get these gallstones where they'll create some type of gallbladder attack, and then the doctor will say, oh, well, we'll just yank that out and toss it in the trash. Now the person no longer has a place to store this bile. Now, bile can still be coming down from the liver kind of all the time, just kind of trickling in there all the time, but you don't have that bolus to come down and really help neutralize a large portion of food that is leaving the stomach. So without that bolus, if you can't neutralize all those acids, then we create that problem. And that's why we see a lot of diarrhea issues from someone who's had their gallbladder removed. Not all, but it seems to be about half of people that can have that trouble. And maybe the bile is just coming down here, kind of trickling all the time, enough to help neutralize those acids, help us digest our food correctly, help us break down our dietary fats, all the things that need to happen for all of this to be happy down here. But for a lot of people, it just doesn't. And when it doesn't, when the bile's not coming down, there's usually going to be a diarrhea response. Now, some people can have their gallbladder removed and have constipation because, again, they don't have any stomach acid up here to help acidify things. So when it doesn't get neutralized, it's not a big problem. Things move slow and it get constipated anyways. So it's really going to vary from person to person depending on a lot of factors. And that's why this can be so hard for people to figure out an answer, especially with the medical world. The medical world really likes to find an answer. Oh, I want to find an answer to that. I want to find one solution that's going to fix that problem for everybody. And when we're looking at it that way, there's never going to be an answer because we all process foods differently. We have different factors that are creating these symptoms. And until we can learn how to look at the person, we're going to have a hard time really battling and winning against any significant issue like this. So where all this IBS stuff can really be magnified is that when food does not get broken down like it's supposed to, it doesn't get acidified correctly, the bile doesn't come out, the pancreas doesn't do all these things that help us digest our food. When those things aren't happening, then that food has to break down by rotting and fermenting. And those processes create more gases and more pressure. So you have this person that could have either of these digestive malfunctions going on, either a lack of stomach acid or bile that is not flowing correctly. So now they're not breaking down their food, it has to rot and ferment, that creates more gases, right? And then they come down here and they have all of this overgrowth that's there that came in because the front door wasn't closed. So all this overgrowth is creating even more gases and pressure. And then you take these foods, they're eating foods that are higher in Fodmaps that have more fermenting going on, and you can see that it just really magnifies the whole situation to where it's just out of control. So there's a lot of different layers of issues that a person could work on and improve that have the ability to create improvement, right? So if a person has lost their gallbladder there, then they have the ability to supplement with ox bile. It's like a supplemental version of bile to help neutralize acids and such. But the manufacturers on the label will say, here, take this with your meal. And the problem is you're taking ox bile with your meal when it's supposed to get acidified. You're putting it right in the stomach there, and that's neutralizing those acids before it has the ability to start breaking that food down. So the timing can be very important, and we want to take ox bile supplements away from food. And if you're a person that's lost their gallbladder, we'll put a link in the description below for our video on how to adjust ox bile dose and timing to figure out what's going to work right for you. But now we're going to take this up even another step and see how complicated this can be for some people and why it's so hard for them to find a solution, because we need to understand water traffic. And it was Dr. Emanuel Rivisi who helped us understand that the body has this natural circadian rhythm at the cellular level. So during the day, the body should be in this catabolic state where it's very good at creating energy, kind of keeping us going all day, but it's also good at breaking things down so that they can be rebuilt and renewed. And then at night, we're supposed to move into this anabolic state where the body's very good at sleeping and resting and repairing and rebuilding. So both of these states are appropriate. The problem is some people can get really stuck in one of these states most of the time, or maybe they're just crammed way too far into one of these states. And when they're really stuck in one of these states, it can create a wide variety of health issues. And one of the things that we want to understand is that when someone's stuck in this catabolic state, the body will send more of the water to the bowels and less to the kidneys. So with more water going to the bowels, that can create a chronic diarrhea issue. If someone's really stuck in this anabolic state, then it sends more water to the kidneys and less to the bowels. A lot of these folks will be up peeing 8, 9, 10 times a night because the body's sending so much of the water to the kidneys. So with some people who deal with this back and forth, oh, I got constipation sometimes, I have diarrhea sometimes, well, it takes a lot of resources to make this switch from day to night like we're supposed to. And if somebody's not breaking down their food and accessing all the nutrients in that food, they may not have as many resources. It may be very difficult for the body to switch back and forth. Maybe they only can get up enough resources to switch back and forth every few days. Maybe they're stuck in this state for days at a time and really feeling constipated. The body finally brings it over here, and now they're stuck in this state, and all the water's going to the bowels, and they have diarrhea. So this is one possible cause that can create either a chronic diarrhea issue, a chronic constipation issue, or a problem where a person gets stuck in one state for days at a time, and that's why they're alternating back and forth. So what a person can do is they can just look at their body chemistry and see, do I appear to be leaning way too far in one direction or the other? And if I am, I can take steps to improve that imbalance. And when I improve that imbalance, does this issue of the diarrhea improve for me? Do I see that, oh wow, that really was a factor? Or if I improve this imbalance, or there doesn't appear to be an imbalance, then maybe it's some of those other digestive things that we talked about. So if you don't know how to look at your chemistry, if you're new to this channel, we'll put a link in the description below for our totally free digestion course that'll walk you through how to run like simple self-tests at home using tools you could pick up at a pharmacy or a health food store to get an idea. Am I leaning too far in one of these directions, and what steps will help me improve that if I am? And that free course also goes over looking at your digestion and figuring out which aspects may not be working correctly and what steps you can take to improve those scenarios. So when we go to look at, what are the steps that I should be taking? What's going to help me figure out what's going to work best for me? We have to look at a lot of factors. Okay, we can try this lowering the Fodmap level, and we can just adjust our diet to see, do our symptoms improve? If our symptoms improve, that's very motivating. You get to see that, wow, I did something. I made changes and I really improved my circumstances with the effort that I put in. And if you can do that, that's great. That's not fixing the problem in most cases, but it can help a person feel and function better. Then we want to look at any of those digestive malfunctions like the low stomach acid, the poor bile flow. If the bile has become too thick and sticky, then we can take steps to thin it out so that it flows better, so that it will come and help neutralize those acids leaving the stomach, and we won't have such a diarrhea issue. One thing to think about though is we need to understand that there can be two sides of that. Sometimes diarrhea can be caused by everything being way too alkaline. Maybe someone's bile is flowing okay, but they have no stomach acid. That over-alkalinity can create diarrhea as well in situations like bile acid malabsorption or bile acid diarrhea. And we have videos on that topic that we'll put in the description if you need to dig into that a little bit as well. But we need to consider any invaders that might be there in the digestive tract that are creating a lot of trouble in one way or another. We can take steps to bring those down and wipe out those bad guys. And we need to think about, do I have an imbalance that's sending too much water to the wrong place? Maybe some of the time or all of the time, depending on what kind of issues I'm dealing with. So you can see that this can be a little bit complicated. We need to look at all these factors. We need to think about timing of any supplements we're going to be using. We need to think about what other factors may contributing, because for some people, they're going to be dealing with more than one of these underlying causes, more than one thing at a time, or maybe sometimes this underlying cause is really creating the trouble and they'll take steps that they think are going to fix that, but they still have the problem because this other underlying cause is creating it at other times. So it's really about looking at your body, doing the work. You can see that I can't just give you a plan. Oh, just do this, everything's going to be golden. You might be able to see some improvement to symptoms by changing your diet, but to fix the problem, each person is going to have to look at how their body's operating a little bit to get insights into what steps are going to be most effective for them. So if you're also dealing with the constipation issues, you're not just having diarrhea, you want to watch that other video too on IBS-C to get some of those other insights that I go deeper into creating those constipation issues. So you can jump over right now and check out our video on steps to improve IBS-C. And if you don't deal with the constipation stuff, you can jump over right now and dig deeper into how the digestive process is supposed to work and improving those issues with our video on full digestive reset. I can't wait to hear about your results.